بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا وأسوتنا وحبيبنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. MashaAllah, it's good to see everyone. So tonight we're going to continue in our discussion of this small booklet entitled Hidden Blessings, 40 Wisdoms Behind Calamities, Difficulties, Trials, and Tribulations. Alhamdulillah, I think we'll probably finish this, the remainder of the book within the next, maybe before the end of the year, inshallah ta'ala, in the next 4 or 5 weeks, bidnillah ta'ala. So, what he's really trying to do for us, inshallah, is to help us understand calamities, difficulties, trials, tribulations, etc. But also maybe in his own right, he was writing almost 200 years ago, addressing the way we understand these trials and tribulations. So there were some people, particularly, and he uses the word in the next section, ignorant Sufis. So he talked about, last week we talked about Sufis, and we mentioned that, don't be scared of a word, look at the meaning of the word. What is the author intending, right? So then in the next section he talks about ignorant Sufis. What does he mean by that? So he gets into a discussion of, there were some people in an effort to get close to Allah, they thought they had to abandon the world, and to an extreme degree that any form of enjoyment, any form of pleasures, any form of relaxation was looked at as a negative thing. And on the flip side of that, they looked at difficulties, putting yourself through burdens and struggles as in and of itself an act of worship. Now it's true that, and he'll get into that in the coming sections, that yes, we're encouraged to push ourselves and to struggle and strive hard to do good in our lives, and to not be lazy and not just give our whole lives for those pleasures and those comforts. But he's trying to give us an understanding of how we balance some of these concepts, inshallah. So that's where we left off in the previous discussion. So he mentions wisdom number 19. He says, nowadays Sufis, we'll get into the term, but he says, nowadays Sufis are caught up in thinking that the more they punish themselves, their lower selves, the more Allah will be pleased with them, even if the sacrifice of theirs is contrary to the Sharia itself. To this point, some even declared meat as haram upon themselves out of their fanaticism, while others avoid abstaining from even drinking cold water. Well, cold water it's an enjoyment to drink cold water on a hot day. So I'm not going to drink cold water. Moreover, some have refused to sleep on beds, while others have gone so far as paralyzing their own limbs. So again, he's talking about people who take things to extremes. He said, I saw once during midsummer a man sitting encircled by fires that he had lit for himself. He says, these acts are nothing more than ignorance. Nevertheless, you should not let these deviations cast doubt upon the struggles of all those saintly people who endured great difficulties in order to reform their lower selves. So he gets into, again, really highlighting the difference between struggling to push ourselves to do good in the world and avoid sins and better ourselves. And that requires a bit of self-determination, willpower, strength, giving up pleasures, giving up comforts, as a means to get close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, versus just causing ourselves pain and suffering as an act of worship. He said there's two different things, right? So he says the pure Sharia, this religion of Islam, has set limits for everything, and it is necessary to allow the nafs, the self, some comfort, in addition to providing it with its necessities. And he says it's been narrated from Salman al-Farisi that he once visited Abu Darda and observed that he would spend the entire night in worship. Upon observing this, Salman prevented him from doing so. Eventually the matter was brought to the Prophet ﷺ, who said, Salman has spoken the truth. And then he then mentioned the Shari'i limitations for this matter, saying, verily your nafs, yourself, your body has a right over you. He said, sadly, ignorant Sufis have destroyed this tasawwuf. They've destroyed this idea of spirituality, purification of the heart, the spiritual struggle to get close to Allah, and made it a mockery. They said spend 40 days in a khanqa. A khanqa is like it's a corner of a masjid that's just set aside for like ittikaf, for people just to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Divorce your wife, disown your children, Close your doors and you don't interact with people. Take only 40 chickpeas and allocate one each day for your seclusion. Right? They went to extremes and these things. Without this, you cannot be a real Sufi. So he says, he's quoting these people. He said, I say in response, by Allah, I swear to Allah, you can be a real Sufi, right? A real, he used an earlier word in one of the very early sections of the book, salik, someone who's intentionally journeying to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We're all going to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, whether we like it or not. We're all going to Allah. But some of us want to go to Allah. Some of us are planning for that. We're working for that meeting with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That in the spiritual terminologies of a lot of our scholars, they call that a salik. The person who is eagerly running to meet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, spiritually running to meet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He said, no, by Allah, you can be a real Sufi even if you wear expensive clothes, recline on pillows and armrests, live in wealth and eat delicious foods. But not by sitting in your house. He said, you have to go to a sheikh in order to get it. Meaning that spiritual refinement is not something that you'll find by accident. You need to better yourself. You need to go to people who've learned how to better themselves, who have went to people who have known how to better themselves. So you go to a scholar, you go to a teacher, and you ask them, and you learn how to better yourselves. Right? You're not just going to come up with it on your own, sitting in your home. Right? So then he says, one of the wisdom number 20, one of the causes of our worries in our life, and I think this is really, really practical for us to understand. And we had talked about in the last khutbah about tawakkul, the concept of tawakkul, reliance upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So he says some of the causes of our worries is over-reliance on planning, meaning the worldly steps. So again, our scholars, you always find them trying to help us understand concepts which seem to be opposing. We have a concept which is rely upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He's going to take care of everything. We have another concept which is if I don't do it, nobody's going to do it. I got to do everything. Right? And we find that the Islamic path, so to speak, is in the middle between the two. It doesn't abandon one or the other, right? So he says, I have mentioned many times in the past that the cause of most worries and stress is our constant planning while expecting specific outcomes. So this is the point. When we do not get the expected result from the plan we devise, we get frustrated and stressed out. Okay, I'm going to go to med school. Okay, I'm going to study for the MCAT. I'm going to take this test. Okay, I'm going to apply to this university. I'm going to get it. And then as soon as something doesn't go the way we planned it, we just get so upset and so worried and so, we just think that it's that easy, that you do 1 + 1 = 2 and everything's going to be fine, right? It doesn't always work like that. He said, it is as if we're trying to rule over the system of Allah, a system that is totally out of our control. In reality, the one who is doing the planning is himself in the absolute control of Allah. We plan, but we're in Allah's control. This is why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has clearly declared His complete control over the creation and absolute power over all things to negate and nullify the power and control of any other entity. So the commentator, Sheikh Tameem Ahmadi, who's in California, he adds an important clarification. He says, this does not mean that we should leave off planning altogether. Rather, it is necessary to make appropriate plans, but it is simultaneously necessary to know that the ultimate result of all plans are in Allah's hands. If we understand this, then when things don't go according to plan, quote unquote, there will be no stress experienced because one is fully aware that everything unfolds according to Allah's perfect wisdom. And while I was reading this, there's a very clear example. The Prophet ﷺ, we've talked about this previously, he mentioned that there will be Anbiya and Rusul, the prophets and messengers, who will come on the Day of Judgment with whole, ummahs, whole nations, millions and billions of people, right? Like the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. Other prophets will come with just a few people. On the Day of Judgment, the people that believed in them and followed them will just be a few. And there will be prophets they will come on the Day of Judgment with not even one follower. Would we say that they failed? We would see, like, man, you worked 100 years, or in some cases, some of these prophets, they live very long lives. You worked all this life and you only have a few followers. Nobody followed you. We would see that, in our materialistic, in our capitalistic mindset, where every year we need an increase, otherwise we're failing. Our stockholders are going to fire the CEO and the board of whatever because the stocks aren't going up. There's not a constant increase. That means you're failing, right? We would see that as a failure, but it wasn't a failure because it wasn't their job to guide people. It was their job to do the work, their job to deliver the message. That's it, right? So, alhamdulillah, we have a good example, as Allah mentions, we have a good example in the prophets and messengers. That we're responsible for our efforts, we're not responsible for the outcomes. When we know that, we can take a deep breath and relax. Put in your work, do what you have to do, and leave the rest with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Alhamdulillah. Let's read one more, inshallah, and then we'll stop, inshallah. And this is the last one in the first part of the book, 21 wisdoms, and then he jumps into kind of a subsection of the book, inshallah. He says, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. He says, striving for Allah's sake is the only way to experience closeness to Allah. So again, he's going back to this idea of we want to strive, we want to push ourselves, we want to try to better ourselves and be actively always looking for opportunities to be better people and to get away from sin and get away from our flaws. And that's not going to happen just laying on the couch. But that effort and that struggling is not meant that we're meant to punish ourselves and just live in, not enjoy any moments of comfort or experience any sort of worldly happiness. So there's this balance. He says, when the one who is treading the path of this religion devotes himself completely to striving for the sake of Allah, he will receive the fruits of guidance as per the promise of Allah. So what does Allah say? وَالَّذِينَ جَاهَدُوا فِينَا لَنَهْدِيَنَّهُمْ سُبُلَنَا. Jazakumullah khair. In Arabic, sometimes when there's more than 2-3 syllables, sometimes I get tongue-tied. لَنَهْدِيَنَّهُمْ سُبُلَنَا. Alhamdulillah. And Allah says, and we will certainly guide those who bear difficulties, for our sake, who do mujahada, struggling for our sake. We will guide them to our path. We will guide them to our path. He says the reason for this is that Allah has established both a spiritual and a divine connection between the body and the soul. And I think this takeaway is very important for us. There's a connection between the body and the soul. When the limbs engage in acts of obedience to Allah, rays of light shine into the heart. As a result, humility, purity of soul, and luminosity are developed. Then he says, and when the heart is illuminated and reformed, the limbs are also made humble and obedient. They subsequently begin to engage in acts of worship with vigor and enjoyment. This is because striving for the sake of Allah, mujahada, is the only way to experience closeness to Allah, what they call mushahada. While preparing for this discussion, I found an interesting quote from a Moroccan scholar named Ibn Ajiba, who was he wrote a tafsir of the Quran as well. He said, "Al-mujahadatu ala qadriha takunu al-mushahada. فَمَنْ لَا مُجَاهَدَةَ لَهُ لَا مُشَاهَدَةَ لَهُ." That the amount of insight, this is the word that we call mushahada, spiritual insight, spiritual understanding, witnessing or seeing in a spiritual sense. And he's referring here to what the Prophet ﷺ told Jibreel, that you worship Allah as if you see Him, and if you do not see Him, you know that He sees you, right? The spiritual insight. This will only come according to the strength of your efforts. As much work as you put in, the increase in your spiritual insights. But what's interesting here is this idea of the limbs and the body working together or benefiting each other. So he said, if the limbs are obedient, light shines into the heart. So this was some of the early Muslims. There were some of them when they became Muslim, it wasn't, I don't want to say it was by force. It wasn't by force. But it wasn't with the kind of conviction that you found some of the other, Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anhu, Abu Bakr, they became Muslim out of sheer conviction. There were other people, the Shahada, it wasn't out of the same level of certainty and conviction and love for the deen. There were the other things going on. But what happened is they submitted themselves. Even with a shaky beginning, they submitted their limbs, and from the submission of their limbs, light shined into their hearts, and they started to love the religion. And there's plenty of examples of that. We can maybe, I want to find more examples. On Friday night, we're going to start talking about the lives of the companions, radiallahu anhum, inshallah. So there's some good examples that we'll try to pull up, inshallah. And on the flip side of that, when the heart is illuminated, it draws the body, the limbs will manifest that obedience. So some people started the other way. So we had this discussion with Sheikh Rida as well recently, about a couple of months ago maybe, about doing dhikr. Is dhikr of the heart better? Is dhikr of the tongue better? Obviously dhikr with the heart and the tongue is the best. But I mentioned that for me, for many, many years, I would say, you know what, I'm not going to do dhikr right now because I'm distracted. My heart's not going to be in it. But what I realized over time is that no, even if you don't, your heart might not be in it in the moment. Sometimes you need your limbs to jumpstart the heart. You would think it would be the opposite way, that the heart starts and then the tongue. That's maybe the normal way of doing business. The heart starts and then the tongue speaks. But sometimes your tongue starts and it jumpstarts the heart. It reminds the heart because your ears hear it, your tongue is moving, you're right. And maybe you have a sibha or something. Your multiple limbs are being engaged in that, and maybe your heart will wake up to what you're doing, inshallah ta'ala. So that's what he's talking about, this connection between the body and the soul. And I think this is a good place to stop, inshallah ta'ala. Well, he mentions here to end with, if it is meant, let's stop here, inshallah. Jazakumullah khair. We ask Allah to accept from us, to forgive our shortcomings and our mistakes, allow us to benefit from the insights of our scholars and our teachers and the prized predecessors of this ummah, and to allow any reward or goodness that we might have to be in the scales of our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam on the day of judgment. Subhanaka Allahumma wa bihamdik, nashhadu an la ilaha illa anta, nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk. Allahumma salli wa sallim wa barik ala sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Wa akhir da'wana in alhamdulillahi rabbil alamin. Ameen. Assalamu alaikum.